Many of you will remember Dan from last year. So Dan is, unfortunately, the Associate Dean for Sciences at Dartmouth. And to be a dean, for those of you who know academic life, realize that's a curse. But he's also, fortunately, the William H. Newcomb Distinguished Professor of Computational Science, where he's also director of the Newcomb Institute for Computational Science and Professor of Mathematics and Computer Science. He's a long-term collaborator of mine, and his work is really fascinating. He wrote a beautiful book called Stalking the Riemann Hypothesis, and most recently, I guess, a book that touches on some of the issues he'll be discussing today, What Are the Arts and Sciences? A Guide for the Curious. So, Dan.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you. I just wanted to start with a tiny movie, Break the Ice. Maybe some of you have seen this, actually. I don't know if there's any sound here. Oh, sorry. Oh, I should be plugged in. Where's my technical assist? It's actually not so important, but the sound at this point. The sound later will be important. I'll need you again. So this was at the Guggenheim about a year ago. Anybody? I don't know if anyone saw it. And it's, well, it's a robot artist. We could argue about, I mean, it's made by people and it's in the museum, so whether or not the piece we're seeing is the art or the art that the robot is making is the art. But it's a machine artist and quite mesmerizing, actually. If you watch it, it's huge and really mesmerizing to see. So what I'm super interested in are ideas of the machine as artist, sometimes the machine as collaborator in the arts, and despite the opening robot visual artist, what I'm really interested in is the machine in the literary arts. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, and aspects of that as they relate to creative intelligence, and framed in particular in the context of Turing tests, which probably almost all of you know about what the Turing test is, but I'll talk about that a little bit of the history and kind of how I came around to this. So the original Turing test, as many of you may know, Turing didn't call it the Turing test. He was writing a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. It was a 1950 paper. And the question that he posed was, can a machine think? That's what he was really interested in. And he certainly knew that that was a super complicated question. So what he says in that paper, I'll just read it aloud, we may hope that machines will eventually compete with men in all purely intellectual fields, but which are the best ones to start with? Even this is a difficult decision. Now, so all intellectual fields, and can a machine think? And then, long story short, you read the entire paper, and what he comes up with at the end is, well, roughly, could I create a chatbot that's indistinguishable from a person as proxy for competing with people in intellectual endeavors, which is a sort of curious place to end. Now, but that's roughly what he came up with as a test, and that's what we often think of as the Turing test. Now, again, as many of you know, and if you saw the movie, The Imitation Game, Turing's idea, and it's written in the paper, was based on something called the Imitation Game, which itself was an interesting kind of thing relative to Turing. So the imitation game is not to distinguish a person from a machine, but actually you would have a person behind a screen, roughly, and through interrogation, not any direct questioning, but just by chatbot, but with two humans, you were supposed to determine whether or not your interlocutor was a man or a woman. And raises all kinds of interesting questions. Well, what would it mean for a man to imitate being a woman? And what would it mean for a woman to imitate being a man? And sort of interacting with Turing's life as a closeted gay man creates a sort of interesting story even about the Turing test. But that's where he starts in this kind of imitation game. If we, in the future, maybe the machines will be playing imitation games with us. They're the ones conducting the test in this little cartoon. But this is the idea. So machines being indistinguishable from people in certain aspects. Now, so he starts off basic. So this test is about social intelligence. We would all recognize that now. I don't know that they would have recognized that in the 50s, but having a conversation is a particular intelligence. Some of you, I know, are great at it. Some of you, to be honest, are terrible at it. So that is a certain intelligence in some way. That said, the early Turing tests were all about beating machines or machines beating people. That was the test. We were, again, coming back to Turing's framing of it, we were engaged in some mano-a-mano competition or electrode competition with machines in certain intellectual domains, and that's where we went. Checkers, although checkers didn't, so this is a picture of Art Samuel, who wrote the first checkers program, but checkers didn't, the people didn't lose until 1994. But you know, we eventually lost again in 1997. So chess, we now are beaten at. Jeopardy, we now are beaten at. And Go, of course, we now are beaten at. And it's this long litany of not, again, not imitating people, but beating people. So Turing tests, I mean, what would it mean for a chess machine to play like a person? It would lose a lot. And hopefully it would lose in interesting ways, but it wouldn't win all the time. No people win all the time. So it's actually not imitating a person. And David and I like to joke that these aren't Turing tests, but rather these are Terminator tests in which you are trying to vanquish the human from various intellectual domains. Of course, the AI forefathers had other things in mind. They also wanted machines to be writing better mathematical proofs than humans. That was one of the other early directions, which they still can't do. So these are all interesting, and all kinds of interesting things have come out of these framings or these competitions, if you like, between people and machines. I was interested in something that actually didn't feel like a competition, to be honest. I was more interested in machines creating artwork that could pass as human. As I said, I'm particularly interested in the literary arts, and the thing I want to tell you a little bit more about today, or mostly about today, is a challenge. It's not a competition. I mean, I suppose you can win at poetry. There are poetry slams. But I don't see it as that. I see it more as a challenge. And the question of, can a machine produce, for example, a sonnet that passes as human generated? And there's, I think there's actually a lot packed into that kind of challenge. What does it mean for it to pass as human is actually a complicated question. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. And there were other challenges in these, what we now call these Turing tests in the creative arts. The Turing test is nevertheless a good branding, even though it's not a competition. And I'll talk about some others, but it's the sonnet one that I'll try to focus on here. Sorry, so as I said, you know, there is a history of machines as artists, but the literary arts is the one that I want to focus on most directly. So let me take a slight feint before I get directly into poetry. We're trying to get machines to create new sequences of words that have meaning that we don't balk at, that there's no, if you like, literary uncanny valley, that they don't sort of, that's not quite right. I don't think a person would have said it that way. We want to actually get to something that feels human. Now, in writing, that's already happening, as many of you probably know. Some of the stuff you're reading every day was almost surely written by robots. They're writing the easy stuff, weather reports, financial reports, etc. Things where most of what you want out of this story is a collection of facts, but you're happier receiving it as a tiny story. Okay? So, big company, Automated Insights, and this This game digestion, this game summary was generated by roughly a scorecard plus some extra data from some sports data aggregator. And so this is written by a machine. So State College, PAAP. Dylan Tice was hit by a pitch with bases loaded with 1 out in the 11th inning, giving the State College Spikes a 9-8 victory over the Brooklyn Cyclones on Wednesday. Danny Hudzina scored the game-winning run, blah, 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 blah. So you could imagine, right, high level, what that algorithm could look like, okay? A little bit of NLP sort of interpolating the actual scorecard, okay? It's easy to kind of pick out the important points in a game. A home run was hit. When did the score change? What was the actual, I should start with a discussion of the final score. Who were the pitchers? Did the pitcher get a lot of strikeouts? Where should I put that in the story? Again, high level, you can imagine building that out into a story. Okay, so highly data intensive, and roughly the narrative is an interpolation of the data. So machines as co-authors. Well, the truth is that machines have been co-authors for a while now, like it or not. Anybody who writes in Microsoft Word, unless you turn off the little paperclip widget or whatever it is now, or when you write, your stuff underlined, your bad spelling, your punctuation, I suppose referenced back to some shrunken white null model or something. It highlights things that it doesn't like. And if you're like me, I feel like I don't want to argue with the machine. I'm just going to try to get rid of that stupid highlight, that squiggly line underneath. And there you go. I know Microsoft Word is writing some of my papers for me, and I can't stand it, but I'm sort of too lazy, I guess, to get around it. And that's true of all of us. Interesting comparison. Like, I don't quite know how to do it, but how has Microsoft actually changed in aggregate the writing style of society? It's a pretty interesting question. But nevertheless, machines have been co-authors for quite some time. In math, machines are actually explicitly co-authors. So the third author of this paper on almost avoiding permutations, and this is not a shit journal, this is an actually good journal that I'd be happy to publish a paper, and it's not a Hindawi published blah, blah, blah. It's discrete mathematics, and the second author in that paper is a machine. Shalosh Biachad is an actual algorithm, an implemented algorithm, a package, if you like, written by Doron Zeilberger at Rutgers. And Shalosh Biachad has a Google Scholar page. Has written papers and is acknowledged there. And I'm still trying to get a hold. Actually, Vince Vader was a postdoc at Dartmouth. I'm trying to get a hold of the people who were on the editorial board when that paper was written to see if they cared, if they knew, that there's a machine, but now there's a machine who's a co-author. And so there's also a machine that I guess is a citizen of Saudi Arabia, but this I think is much more interesting. So now, all right, machines can be co-authors. I mean, look, to be honest, when I was a graduate student, there's certainly a paper or two that I was on that I was basically Shalosh Biachad for my thesis advisor. It's okay, but so that's been happening for a while. It's just been implemented in the human graduate student generally. Weather reports, financial reports, box scores, all those kinds of things, that's one kind of writing. But a huge challenge is creative writing, which I think touches in interesting ways on Michael's talk, because creative writing is often about doing something new, something close to what's been done, probably not too far away from what's already been done, and how might machines generalize that. So I was trying to think about that when Michael was talking. But nevertheless, it is held out as one of these great challenges. It's like, well, a machine can do X, Y, or Z, but it can't write a beautiful sonnet or write a great short story. And it was so interesting to me that in the movie Her, which was one of these near future movies, Joaquin Phoenix, if you may remember, so like everything in this world is automated, and there's even an operating system who you could fall in love with, but at the end of the day, they actually couldn't get a computer program to write love letters. Like for all these things that are going on in this near future society, there's no machine that could go back. There's no machine that could be a chatbot, if you like, in the epistles of love. It just couldn't happen. So it was interesting to me that was their example. So passing as human artists, and in particular passing as poetry, that's what I was interested in first. So we had this little challenge, which we called poetics. If you put an X at the end of something, it means it's digital these days. So I chose sonnets because, sort of coming back to the game summary thing, there is a sense in which sonnets are described by a high-level algorithm. So Shakespearean sonnet, you have 3 quatrains, a rhyming couplet, particular kind of rhyme scheme, but they've just been executed by humans for all these years. The humans have been executing the algorithm. So how might a computer do it? So that was the challenge. And the idea was, so when given a noun or a noun phrase input, the machine should generate sonnets, and they should be new sonnets. It shouldn't be looking through some huge database of sonnets that have ever been written and finding one that had that keyword in it. And it should sort of create a lot of sonnets. In fact, potentially an infinite, countable number of sonnets, to be precise. And more importantly, so it could definitely make sonnets. Okay, again, high level. People who code much better than I can, a little bit of NLP, you can do that. But can it pass for human? Now, that's a really complicated question. What does it mean for the sonnet to pass for human? See, so I wanted the machine to write an average sonnet. I don't even know what that is, but that's what I wanted. I didn't want some groundbreaking postmodern sonnet. I kind of wanted a sonnet that would be generated by an 8th grade class of kids first entering poetry. That was what I wanted, roughly. And so to give you the flip side of this, and I won't read the whole thing, this sonnet is a sonnet made by a person, and I probably shouldn't have told you that, but let's read a little bit of it. The lyre bird giblets in the frying pan, cheep crisply to the sibilant blue gas. A Congo mouth gulps a blonde demitasse, then spews on the flowered rug from Ispahan. I'm not going to go on. So this is a sonnet. It's a surrealist sonnet by the poet Clark Ashton Smith. You could go look it up. But when I was thinking of human sonnets, I actually had in mind, and then it comes back to a test kind of thing. We would mix the AI sonnet, the machine sonnet, with human sonnets, and then ask people to try to distinguish them. That's it's a very particular kind of test. And we had all kinds of arguments. Well, should we actually just give them a bunch of human sonnets, and would you get the society to give you a distribution of responses or some scale of how human you think they are, and then the machine-generated ones would have to fit the same distribution? That was much too complicated. At the end of the day, we just chose for a very simple, can you pick it out? What do you think this is, machine or human? Wait, what's this? Okay. So let's actually look at one. So I'm going to bring up 2 sonnets here, and they're either both machine, both people, or one machine and one person. So here's a sonnet, and probably not everyone can read it, so I'll try to declaim it from up here. And be very careful crossing the streets, how fair an entrance breaks the way to love. Left doors leading into the apartments, just then a light flashed from the cliff above. The fields near the house were invisible. Objects of alarm were near and around. The window had only stuck a little from the big apple tree down near the pond. The large cabin was in total darkness. Come marching up the eastern hill afar. When is the clock on the stairs dangerous? Everything seems so near and yet so far. Behind the wall, silence alone replied. Was then even the staircase occupied? So, machine or man? How many machine? How many man? Human. Thank you. All right, great. So, one more. Living by trust, the gardener plants the seed, puts it away beyond her power of sight. She trusts the universe to share her need, to rise through quiet darkness to the light, to birth the hidden germ that's deep within, unfurl green life already formed inside, and nurture it until it can begin to feed itself upon the old life that's died. It helps that she has learned some good techniques, some tricks to save from, some tricks to save from bug and blight and rust, some ways to make fertility increase, but most of all, it helps she's learned to trust. She knows the force of sprout and womb and nest that works when we let go control and rest. So, human or machine? Human. How many say human? How many machine? Okay. All right, so facts. The first one was accomplished by a machine, by a small group at Thomson Reuters in last year's challenge. Cherise Smiley led that group. And the second sonnet is by Thomas Kinder, who is human. And just out of curiosity, so the people who saw the first one as machine, just shout out why.
Incoherent. No human emotion. It couldn't stay on top.
So let me ask you, everywhere or throughout, or sort of throughout the line of it? Because, I mean, how's that first stanza? I mean, it might not be great. Tim, it's not great poetry. I'll give you that. But on the other hand, honestly, not bad. If I were going to write it, whatever. It's naive. But anyway, I'm not a poetry critic. But it certainly has. While the entire thing, I totally agree. And actually, the one that seems to often give it away is right here. When is the clock on the? I don't know. It's just whatever. And the end isn't great. But it has flashes of coherence, and if I dare say, even beauty in some places. Whereas most people will say that, this one, it just makes sense. There's a narrative. It feels connected. It feels like that there's a story there. And I totally agree with you. So we ran this a couple of times, and there were some prizes given. Totally fun. And again, so nobody actually beat the human, okay, in the sense that there was no machine that actually generated sonnets that were identified more often as human than as machine. Okay, but there was some extraordinary work, and the programming is very interesting. I showed this to what people sometimes object to. I mean, they even had a subroutine that does near rhymes, because a good poem won't be all rhymes. Okay, which I thought was totally clever. Big database of near rhymes and trying to use that. And anyway, and it's a lot of real intelligence, in fact, going into that. I also think it's fun that there was a human sonnet that was most often mistaken for a machine, but generally around the same kinds of criteria that you were all saying, just some kind of lack of coherence. But this brings up sort of the judging kind of part, like what does it actually mean, human or machine? And then, in fact, as many artists and poets have said to me, some people feel like the question's actually completely misguided. It is an art form. Okay, it's a kind of poetry. You might hate it because you've been acculturated to liking certain kinds of poetry, but it is an art form. And then the person who wrote the algorithm, or the team that wrote the algorithm and implemented it, are they poets or not? They're certainly artists in some way, but it's I think a range of very interesting questions. So will machines ever write poetry? I mean, let's put aside should machines write poetry for a moment. Will they ever write poetry? And I love this quote. Computers will be able to write great poetry when they can commit suicide for being fat, ugly, and unpopular. By a poet, not by me. That is posted by a poet in 5 Questions for Poets. So something about a poetic digestion of the human experience. I don't want to give you the idea that there are thousands of teams around the country trying to write sonnets using machines. We've had small pools, but nevertheless, I find the challenge extraordinarily interesting. And we're going to do it again this year, and hopefully with a little bit of better advertising, we'll get this, we'll be able to spread it a bit. To close, I do want to say that these Turing tests in the creative arts, they weren't all about writing poetry. Actually, yeah, one I didn't mention. There was also something for writing actual narratives, short stories, and the entries were terrible. I think we gave one kind of consolation prize. Stories are hard. They're just, narrative is difficult. Algorithms in the first year was about a machines versus DJs constructing dance sets for, in this case, students who would then vote machine or human. And in that one, actually, some machines did pass as human DJs. Sorry, wrong direction. What I think is a sort of way going, well, whatever, there are lots of ways to go forward, but an interesting thing around the collaborative dimension of this was a competition we ran about machines collaborating with humans in making music. So I want to show you a little video, if I don't screw this up.
Hey, Tail.
Hey, Gus, could you practice Sally Garden with me?
My pleasure.
You get the idea. So Gus Jha is now he's at NYU Shanghai, I think. He was a Newcomb Fellow last year. We had this interdisciplinary postdoctoral program, shamelessly modeled on the SFI program. What Gus has done here, so the computer, you know, it's all dressed up, whatever. That's not, I mean, that's fun, but that's not the interesting part. This is a duet. The machine is following Gus's sounds and accompanying Gus. If Gus played it faster, the machine would play faster. If Gus played with different intonation, the machine would play with different intonation. And so the challenge that we had here was we told people that we're going to use a particular kind of score, okay, and we gave them an instance of it, and they could just, and which again is, if you're an accompanist and you're told in 3 weeks you have to accompany so-and-so playing such and such, they practice together, and then there's the day where they play. And that performance almost surely will not be a replication of one of the performances that they did. So we were trying to create that kind of thing and asking people to distinguish between the two. In that case, people still were able to pick out the machine, but the machine follows pretty well. We had another challenge which was around dancing. So we give people, we give the participants motion capture data of a dancing half of a waltz, I think, if memory serves. And they have to fill in the partner, and then on that day we give them a different set of mocap data on the same waltz that they then have to react to, and the output is 2 mocapped dancers, so at least the data sort of moving around on screen. And for that one, we did have a winner. I think that's probably all I have to say. I might have had something else on another slide, but it's not critical. But anyway, those are some of the things that we've been challenging people to do, just because it's interesting, to be honest. And like I said, this year we're running it again, and we're trying to get more at this narrative construction. I think the challenge this year for narrative is going to be for a machine to write a children's story. But narrative's hard. So anyway, thank you.